Hello and welcome to the August 2025 edition of Ottawa Real Estate Market Update, everyone's favorite monthly YouTube series. And by everyone, of course, I mean the 12 or 13 people who regularly watch these. To those fine folks, you are my everyone. To my everyone, I ask you to do this. Close your eyes and picture the following. You have purchased a pre-construction condo in the most expensive new condo project this city has ever seen, by far. And one day, development on this project, which is a couple years behind schedule, by the way, suddenly stops. And you're sitting there wondering, hey, what the hell? Until you receive a message from the developer and it says, hey, you know that super expensive pre-construction condo I sold you like 6 or 7 years ago? Yeah, well, I'm gonna need you to pay me like 50% more than we agreed to. Otherwise, I just don't think I'm gonna finish it. That's cool, right? You can open your eyes again. All right, the visualization exercise has finished. And I hope no one was driving while doing that. I should have probably mentioned that before asking you to close your eyes. But anyways, the scenario I just painted for you is exactly what about 72 people are dealing with right now. And we're going to tell you all about that and a whole lot more in your August 2025 Ottawa Real Estate Market Update. Let's go. All right, we're going to tell you all about the Mizrahi Mess. It's pretty catchy, right? In the second half of this video. But before we do that, let's talk about how Ottawa's freehold and condo markets have fared in the past month, shall we? Before we get to the stats, a quick note to say that the Bank of Canada had their latest interest rate announcement on July 30th. And in that announcement, they held rates exactly where they are. All right, so usual reminder here that these Bank of Canada rate announcements will only impact variable mortgage rates, right? So if you have a variable mortgage, your rate has not changed. It's also worth noting that fixed mortgage rates have ticked up a little bit, right, over the course of the last few weeks. Right now, a 5-year fixed mortgage with a big 6 Canadian bank will likely have an interest rate in the low 4s, and a 5-year variable mortgage might be like just a tick higher, right? Maybe 0.2, 0.3%, something like that. Most smart people, not me, I'm dumb, but most smart people seem to believe that interest rates are likely to stay like about where they are right now for the foreseeable future. They may tick up or down very slightly here and there, but as of this moment, we're not expecting major movement throughout the rest of the year. As always, take that with a grain of salt because no one really knows for sure what the future holds, including the Bank of Canada. Okay. And of course, because this rate announcement came at the very end of the month, it wouldn't have had much impact on July's sales stats, which we're going to tell you all about right now. Hey, look at that segue. As always, we'll start with Freehold. Those are properties that don't have any condo fees, and we're going to get those stats up on the screen for you in 1, 2, 3. Wow. Okay, there they are. All right, so in Ottawa real estate, July is a month that marks the beginning of the transition from our spring market to the summer and fall markets, which are typically a little slower than spring. And this year was no exception. In July, we sold a total of 822 freehold homes in Ottawa, which was significantly lower than the 1,101 homes we sold in June, the month that comes before July. That being said, 822 sales was still slightly better than last year's July total of 809. And all in all, it's on the low end of a typical July total over the course of the past 10 years, right? And that would be somewhere between about 800 and 1,000 sales. The average sale price of a freehold home in Ottawa also fell in July, came in at about 793,000 and change. And that was about 4.3% lower than June's average of about 829K. Again, that's not unusual, and it's typically just a reflection of the difference in the quality of supply that is available in July compared to May and June. Right? I would not treat the drop as an indication that property values have come down in any meaningful way. In other words, if you bought a home in May, chances are you could turn around and sell that home today for about the same price you paid for it, assuming you've got a good realtor, of course. All right? And just to give you a little added context, July's average sale price of about $793K was the second highest July average we have ever seen. The highest July average, believe it or not, did not come during the 2022 peak, but rather in 2023, which was kind of an odd year, right? If you remember, the market was pretty soft throughout 2023, mainly due to interest rates steadily rising. But then in July of that year, the Bank of Canada signaled that it was finished with the rate increases, and that led to a small bump in the market. July actually ended up being our best month that year as far as prices go. So that was a fun little trip down memory lane. Now let's get back to the present, which is a gift, and talk about inventory, which spiked up this July 2025. As always, I will remind you that inventory is, Ollie? There you go. That's pretty good. All right. It is supply and demand something. That is right. Inventory is supply and demand something. It is a measure of supply and demand all in one, and it is expressed in months. And we started July with 2.52 months of freehold inventory, and we ended with 3.36 months. So about a 33% increase there to our inventory. And what that means in practical terms is that for the month of July, freehold supply outpaced freehold demand in Ottawa. All right. That all being said, 2.52 months is a very low total. 3.36 months, while higher, is still also a low inventory total in the grand scheme of things. At 3.36 months of inventory, we're inching closer to the levels we'd expect to see in a balanced market. But as of right now, our inventory is still within the range we'd expect to see in a seller's market. That being said, our sales to new listings ratio in July was about 49%, which falls squarely in balanced market range. And then our average time to sell was 31 days. And that also just barely falls into the range we'd expect to see in a balanced market, which is 30 to 60 days. So on the whole, I'd say Ottawa's freehold market right now is in a balanced state, though it's still much closer to the seller market side of that spectrum. And I know I'm repeating myself from previous months here. Welcome to the updates. But it's worth mentioning that high quality properties with good floor plans in good neighborhoods are still moving very quickly right now, and multiple offers on those properties continues to be a fairly common occurrence. And so, as is often the case, your experience as a buyer or a seller in this market will greatly depend on property type, location, and price point. That will do it for Freehold this month. I hope you had fun. Ollie, did you have fun?
Oh, all the time.
Ollie always has fun. Emma, did you have fun?
Yeah.
All right, Emma also had fun. Good. I swear there are people behind this camera. I'm not just talking to my imaginary friends, Ollie and Emma. There he is. All right. There you go. Let's talk about how Ottawa's condo market fared last month, because we've got the stats right here. Boom. There they are. Whoa, condo stats. Oh my God. All right, we're really killing it with the segues this month. That one was not as smooth as I thought it would be, though. Now, let's quickly talk condo stats before getting into the condo shit show that we teased at the start of the video. July's condo stats were pretty ho-hum. We sold a total of 287 units for the month. That was predictably down from June's total of 319 sales. It was also less than last year's July total of 307. That being said, over the past 10 years, in a typical July, we'd expect to see condo sales totals land somewhere between the mid 200s and the high 300s. So this year's July total is nothing out of the ordinary. Speaking of ordinary, the average sale price for condos in July came in at about $436,000. And the reason that's ordinary is because condo prices in Ottawa have been flat for a little over 3 years now. And during that span, the average sale price has landed somewhere between about $410K and $455K for almost every single month. The only two exceptions came in May of this year and May of last year, where prices momentarily broke above that $455K threshold, only to then settle right back into their usual range in the months that followed. For what it's worth, I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to the fact that those two blips came in May. I really think it's just a random coincidence that can be explained by normal variance. But if I was thinking of selling a condo sometime next year, I might line things up so that I hit the market at the start of May, right? I mean, I wouldn't say I'm superstitious, but I'm a little stitious, right? All right, moving on here. Condo inventory also predictably rose in July, going from 3.6 months to 3.97 months. On the whole, 3.97 months is still like a low-ish total. It's on the very, very low end of the range we'd expect to see in a balanced market. And as we mentioned in past months, condo inventory varies greatly across property type and location right now. Inventory for townhouse style condos, which are mostly found in the suburbs, is at just 2.89 months, which is actually lower than our freehold inventory. Whereas inventory for apartment style condos is much higher, and it spikes up even more when we focus on downtown apartment style condos, which is very much in a buyer's market at the moment. Wrapping up for condos here, our sales to new listings ratio in July was about 48%, and the average time to sell was 40 days. Both of those stats fall within balanced market territory. But again, when it comes to condos right now, there are multiple very different markets that exist within that property class. It's also worth noting here that if you are someone who would like to own a downtown condo apartment, now is a very good time to start shopping, all right? Those buyers have a lot of bargaining power right now, and there are deals to be had. And then on the flip side, if you're someone who's selling a downtown condo, especially if it's one of your fairly typical like 1 or 2 bedroom cookie cutter units, you have to price it to be the best value out there, bar none. Otherwise, you're just dead in the water. All right, that'll do it for condos this month. Short and sweet. Now let's get to some of the juicier stuff, shall we? All right, so I think this is gonna be a good one. So if you've ever worked with me, or if you pay attention to these updates, you probably already know that I have some pretty major reservations around pre-construction purchases, especially when it comes to condo buildings. And just to be clear, I love condos, like for real. And I'm also certainly not against pre-construction purchases, okay? I think there's absolutely a place for that model and even a need for it. But I also know for a fact that a large percentage of the people that buy into pre-construction projects, especially pre-construction condo projects, fail to properly understand or prepare for the significant risks that come with that type of purchase. When things go wrong with a pre-construction project, they can go really wrong, right? And when that happens, it's always the buyers who end up with the shortest end of the stick. And we are seeing that play out right now in a pretty spectacular fashion with an Ottawa condo development known as the Residences at Island Park. All right, so here is the scoop. The Residences at Island Park is a luxury mid-rise condo building at 1451 Wellington Street. It's right at the corner of Wellington and Island Park Drive in Ottawa's Westboro neighborhood. Now, the developer for that project is Mizrahi Developments, which is headed by Sam Mizrahi. And he is a big-time luxury developer out of Toronto. Maybe not so much anymore, but it's safe to say that at one time, not too long ago, Mizrahi was recognized as like a visionary, right? When it came to luxury condo developments in Canada. His previous projects were known for like ultra premium quality, craftsmanship, finishes, design, like the whole thing. You couldn't do much better. So needless to say, when news broke in 2017 that Mizrahi was going to be developing a project in Ottawa, people got pretty excited. How excited, you ask? Well, when pre-construction sales for the Residences at Island Park first started in May of 2017, units were priced between about $1,100 and $1,300 per square foot. And for what it's worth, those prices did not include parking or storage, which would have run you an extra like 50 to 60K at the time. Now, that sort of pricing today in 2025 would be considered very high here, right? In 2017, it was astronomical. At that time, other pre-construction condo projects in Ottawa were charging between about $600 and a little over $700 per square foot. Also, for some added context, in 2017, the two most expensive ready-to-occupy condos that were sold on Ottawa's MLS system, both of which were luxury penthouses, went for $780 per square foot and $791 per square foot. The other top sales that year all came in below $700 per square foot. So you get a sense of just how expensive these Mizrahi condos were in comparison to the rest of the market here at the time. Now, in spite of the ultra premium pricing, pre-construction sales at 1451 Wellington fared well. Over the course of their 2-year pre-construction phase, they managed to sell 72 of the building's 93 units, about 77%. And so, with pre-construction sales hitting their 70% target, construction on the project officially began in October 2019 with a target completion date of late 2023. However, things quickly began to unravel for Mizrahi Developments from there. You see, at the time, Mizrahi was also the developer on a much larger and much more ambitious project in Toronto called The One, right? And that was set to be the tallest residential structure in all of Canada, right? The One. Asking prices on the units at The One were in like the multi-million dollar ranges, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars. I believe the penthouse was listed for about $40 million, to give you an idea. Unfortunately, that project started to run into major issues with cost overruns and construction delays. That caused a lot of infighting amongst the partners, and it ultimately pushed a lot of the project's investors and stakeholders to pursue costly litigation against Mizrahi Developments, which just made everything worse, right? Now, the problems at The One unfortunately followed Mizrahi to Ottawa, where the residences at Island Park also began to experience major delays and cost overruns, all of which, of course, were greatly exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and the inflationary environment that followed. So things at The One in Toronto eventually got so bad that in late 2023, the entire project was placed into receivership, which essentially means that the lenders took control of the projects in the hopes of preventing any further losses from piling up. Mizrahi Developments was eventually removed from that project altogether, and a new builder has since been brought in to complete the building, right? So pretty much an unmitigated disaster. Now, over in Ottawa, development at the residences at Island Park continued to push forward for about a year after shit had already hit the fan at The One in Toronto. But unfortunately, in late 2024, with the project about 85% complete, Mizrahi Developments got to the point where they were no longer able to meet their financial obligations for the residences at Island Park. In other words, they had run out of money, right? And so this is where things get really interesting. What Mizrahi and his creditors ended up doing was that they filed a claim under Canada's Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, or the CCAA. And what the CCAA is a Canadian law that allows large Canadian companies that are in serious financial trouble to temporarily hit the pause button on their financial obligations and on any creditor action against them. And the goal of all this is to allow that company to negotiate with creditors and attempt to restructure its debts rather than going bankrupt. And of course, the idea here is to try to save jobs, it's to protect investors in the company, and it's to give creditors a better chance of ultimately getting paid than they would if the company went out of business. It's also very important to note here that once a company files a claim under the CCAA, everything that happens from that point forward is court supervised. In other words, any restructuring of debt or agreements reached between the company and its creditors must be approved by the court before going forward. And of course, the idea here is that the court is supposed to make sure that everyone involved gets a fair shake. So, where does this all sit now? Well, under the supervision of the court, Mizrahi Developments and their creditors have come up with a proposal that they say will allow them to complete the building and return value to the stakeholders. And they are calling this proposal the reset model, okay? And it is going to save the project, all right? Now, what is the reset model, you ask? What is this genius plan that all these big brain people with the help of the court came up with to save the residences at Island Park? How is it all gonna work? Well, I got a little excited. Well, I'm gonna tell you. All right, here it is. Are you ready? Ollie, are you ready?
Yeah.
Emma, are you ready? Emma's ready. I don't know if Emma's ready, but Ollie's ready. All right, this is how it's going to work. The developer is going to go back, right, to all the people who purchased units and tell them, hey, guess what? We need you to pay more. Wait, so you could just do that? You could just, wow, what the hell? What the hell? God. You know, I've been selling houses for 10 years, and this whole time, like an idiot, I've been charging my clients exactly what I said I would in the contract. God damn. I've been leaving so much money on the table. I could be driving a Porsche right now. I could live here. I could be living here in unit 4401 at the Icon building. By far the best appointed unit in all of Ottawa. It's not even close. Completely redesigned by Touchstone Interiors. The value here is incredible. It could be mine. It could all be mine. And this whole time, I just had to be like, hey girl, you know how we set 5%? Well, my creditors, Visa and MasterCard, were really breathing down my neck this month, and these problems of mine have just been exacerbated by the expensive meals I've been eating and that trip I just booked. So I'm gonna have to apply a reset model to our listing agreement and charge you 8%, right? But it's okay because I gave 110% when I sold your house. So, just out here trying to maximize stakeholder value, right? God, such an idiot. All right, so the folks who bought into the residences at Island Park are now being approached by the developer, and they are being asked to renegotiate their purchase agreements in order to provide the developer with the necessary funds to complete the project, right? In some cases, buyers have reported being asked to pay 50 to 60% more than their contracted price. Now, the developer and creditors are claiming that they are approaching these negotiations with their fellow stakeholders in good faith. However, in the CCAA, there's something called a disclaimer provision, right? And that provision allows for a creditor to disclaim, which is just a fancy word for terminate, certain contracts or agreements which have become burdensome, right? And which are no longer beneficial or necessary to the restructuring efforts. So Mizrahi and his creditors are seeking to use that disclaimer provision to terminate the purchase agreements of anyone who won't agree to a price increase, right? So it's like, yeah, we're gonna negotiate in good faith here. And just to show you that this is all in good faith, I'm just gonna take my gun out and lay it right next to me on the table while we negotiate in good faith. And that's exactly, or essentially, where things stand today. Now, as of the time of this recording, the courts have yet to rule on whether or not they will allow the pre-construction agreements to be disclaimed if the renegotiations on purchase price prove unsuccessful. It's worth noting, however, that historically, when it comes to the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, the CCAA, the courts have generally ruled in favor of the interests of creditors over those of consumers, sadly. Now, before I wrap, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts on all this. The first thought is this. A lot of the court filings in this case are public record, and they contain a bunch of communication and proposals and such between the developer, creditors, and the buyers, right? And you can find all of that online if you're curious, okay? And I've read through a fair bit of it. And the thing that really struck me, and quite frankly, just grinded my gears, is how now that they're being asked to pony up more money, the buyers are all of a sudden being referred to as stakeholders and partners in this project. The developer and creditors are painting this proposed price increase as being in everyone's best interest, right? And they're claiming that the requests are totally reasonable because property values have increased in the time since pre-construction agreements were signed, right? And so they're not being greedy or unreasonable here. No. They're just asking buyers to pay fair market value, right? And so all of the communication coming out of the developer and creditor camp has this tone of, hey, we're all partners here and we're all in this together, and we have to work collaboratively towards a solution that's fair for all of us, right? And it is fucking bullshit. I'm sorry, but it is. I've seen a ton of pre-construction agreements, and you know what I've never seen in any of them? I've never seen the buyer referred to as a partner, much less treated like one. When it comes to pre-construction purchases, the buyer's role is to give the developer money and then get lost and let the developer do whatever they want until it's time to give the developer more money. Rinse and repeat. And so as a buyer, what happens if your unit is completed years later than the developer promised? Too bad. You still have to close. And as a buyer, what happens if interest rates shoot way up? Too bad. You still have to close. What happens if you lose your job? Too bad. You still have to close. Got a divorce? Too bad. You still have to close. What if you get terminally ill? Too bad. You still have to close. What if you die? Too bad. Your estate still has to close. These are one-way agreements. They are not partnerships. And so to try and paint them that way now because you mismanaged the project and your creditors basically made a bad investment is just incredibly disingenuous. I can tell you for a fact that there are a ton of buyers out there here and in Toronto and other markets who bought pre-construction properties during the peak and who have had to close or who will have to close on homes that are not worth nearly as much as what those buyers paid. And those are properties that were sold in the pre-construction phase when materials and labor were at all-time highs and interest rates were almost double where they are now. So those developers locked in profits when the market was at an all-time high, and in many cases, they likely wound up realizing even greater gains than anticipated because interest rates and the cost of materials and labor all started coming down. And I have to tell you, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have yet to hear of a single one of those developers going back to their buyers and saying, hey, you know what, we understand that the pre-construction home you bought from us is no longer worth what you paid for it, but because it's important to be fair to you, our partners, we're going to reduce your purchase price. Has that ever happened to anyone? Anyone? Didn't think so, right? So the hypocrisy of this whole thing just really irks me, to say the least. A bit of a long one this month, but I got one last thought for you before we wrap up. I know I talk a lot of shit about pre-construction, right? But believe it or not, the takeaway from all this shouldn't be that no one should ever buy a pre-construction home or that we should do away with pre-construction sales altogether. I don't think that at all, truthfully, right? What I hope you take away from this is the notion that when you purchase a pre-construction home, you are essentially relying on a series of predictions about the future. And no one, not you, not the developer, not your mortgage broker, not your buddy who bought a house once, not your dad, not your mom, not even your realtor can predict the future. And we always tend to have this very positive view of where we'll be in the future, right? We always think we'll be better off tomorrow than we are today. And I truly hope that ends up being the case for you and for everyone watching this, and for Ollie and for Emma, all the people. But it's that sort of thinking that can sometimes cause us to fail to properly assess some of the very real risks that come with a pre-construction purchase, which is essentially something you are buying today, but that you're going to have to pay for in the future, no matter what happens, right? As always, it's important to ask the hard questions. What happens if my unit is completed 2 or 3 years late? What happens if interest rates shoot up? What happens if property values go down or if I lose my job? What happens if the developer goes bankrupt mid-project? And so on, right? And if your honest answer to all of those questions is that you'll be okay, then pre-construction might make sense for you, right? On the other hand, if your answer is that you'd be completely screwed or financially devastated, maybe reconsider. And with that, I will say goodbye for this month. As always, if you have any hard questions you'd like to ask me about real estate, let's not make it weird, you can use the Calendly link in my bio to book a discovery call with me, or you can contact me directly using this information right here, right? I appreciate you. I think of you all as my partners, and I hope you all have an awesome month. See you in September.